Hello everyone. In this video we'll look at how we can construct a UI with user parameters that we can use for a macro. There will also be some tricks and tips on how we can customize the look and add extra functionality. In this scene I have a group node. Now you can easily use a group node to encapsulate a set of nodes and expose controls to the user on the group node that drives changes inside. I've already added some nodes inside of my group node, so let's see what there's. I'm going to do Control Enter to go inside. And over here I have 4 primitive create nodes. We're creating a sphere, teapot, torus, and cone. And these are all going into a switch node here. Let's expand out our scene graph so you can see we're currently loading the sphere because it's at 0. And then if I were to highlight this and middle mouse scroll and switch between them. Okay, and then what we're going to do is link this value here to our group node. So we're going to build some user controls and link them. And we're going to go through how that process is done. But first of all, let's look at how you can add parameters to this node. So we click the wrench icon up here and it has this edit user parameters option. So we're going to use that. And it adds this user group parameter and this add button so we can add more parameters inside. And what we're going to do is work our way through this list and I'll explain what these ones do and how you can customize them. Starting off with the number parameter. When we do this, we get another wrench icon and we have the name here and the value. I'm going to click this and rename my parameter to be my number. Okay. Next we have the widget type. So you have all these different types you can choose. I'm just going to leave it as a default for now. And then you have widget options. So what options are available for the type you've selected. We have some conditional visibility and locking options. And then we have the help text. So if you want to add an explanation of what this parameter does or a warning, you can do that there. And we'll go over these later. Let's first of all look at the widget options for the default type. So the first thing is display as integer. So currently I can add this as a float, but if I were to change this to an integer, what it will do is it will truncate that value. So whatever is entered in here, it always just truncates it to an integer. Next, we have this drag minimum and maximum, and it's set to 0 and 1 here by default. But if it is the default, then it ignores these and you can drag as long as you want to go. So if I click on this parameter and drag, it goes as far as I can go. No worries there. But if I were to go back here and set these locally to 0 and 1, now when I drag, I can only go to 0 and 1. Set this now to 100. Next we have the drag sensitivity. So again, if I try this now, you can see that it's incrementing by 0.1. You can change this if you need it to be more sensitive or less sensitive. Now we're getting it at 0.1. And then you can even set it to 1 or 10. Drag sensitivity of 10, so you can very quickly go through your numbers. And it's there you go. Okay. Let's leave that at the default. You can also add a slider. So if we just hit true to this, we get a slider added in. And you can change the options for the slider. So let's say we'll hit this as 10 for its center, maximum of 100. Click OK. And you can see at the center point it is 10, and then it ramps up to 100. And then we also have this exponent option, so we can set this so values increase quicker as we go along. And then there's these three options at the bottom that you'll always have, which are is it constant, so no animation, and default is false. And if we set this to true, it will remove the keyframing. So click OK, keyframing is gone. And if we display only is set to true, we can now no longer change this value. And lastly, we have this label option. So we can give this more descriptive name. We can use spacing and things like that if we want to. So for example, I can change this to my space number and that updates, but the underlying parameter is still the original my number without a space. So that's something to bear in mind if you're ever linking parameters, is to check the actual name. Okay, so now we've done all the options for default. Let's change it to a Boolean. And when we do that, we see we have this yes or no option. And that's interesting because this is a number. So what does yes and no mean? Now is a good time for us to link our parameters. So this will give us the value underneath as well. Let's go back inside my group node, and I'm going to shift click my switch node so we can see both at the same time. And we want to link these together. There's a few different ways of doing that. First, you can copy this and paste expression. And now these are linked. And I set this to no, and it changes to 0. So this is actually a number underneath. And then yes would be 1. And now we're switching between our sphere and teapot. And if we look at the expression, it's saying get param group.user.myname. So this is the group node, and then it's going to the user parameter and then my number, and getting the value of that, which is set to yes, which is 1. The get param function is really good because if I rename this to my macro, for example, it automatically renames it here. And as well, if I rename my parameter to say my special number, this updates as well. But there are other ways of linking, and one of them is to use get parent instead. So what I'll do is change that from get param to get parent. And what that will do is go from my switch node up to my macro. And then from there, I can go .user.my special number. We get the same result here. But now, if I were to rename my parameter and make it no longer special, bye-bye, click OK. Now when I change my value, I'm going to error and say that we cannot find my special number. We would have to change it here as well. Change this. Now it's working again. So that's just something to bear in mind if you use the get parent option. Now, as well as using Python, you can use C++ in here and get this value. Now, to use C++ reference expression, you have to change it from get parent to equals. So equals means it's now C++ reference. And to get parent, instead what we use is the caret character, which looks like an up. And that's what we want to do, is we want to go up. And then we slash to go to the parameters, and we're going to go to user.mynumber. When we do that, it changes this to a teal color. And again, we have the same problem where if we were to rename this parameter, then it will no longer be linked. But C++ reference expressions are faster than Python expressions. So if you are linking parameters inside of a node, it's a good idea to use reference expressions like this because they're quicker. The downside of reference expressions is you cannot do anything with them. Like, for example, if I wanted to add number 1 to this to offset it, it won't allow me to do that. You can, if it was a string, you can add a string to it by using plus and then the name of the string in quotes. But you can't do this with numbers or use any other functions. So if you're just referencing another node, this is the best option. If you're doing something more complicated, then you'll want to use a Python expression. Just to show that that does work, I'll change that back to get parent. And you can see now we can offset this. Okay. Let's just set this back to being a reference expression. Okay, so what other options do we have for our number? We have a pop-up menu. Go to the options of that. And now we just give our choices. So add some choices. So we've got 0, 1, 2, and 3. And you can change the order with this arrow if you want to. I'm just going to do it as you would expect from 0 to 3. And this corresponds with our switch here. So as we change these, I'm going to switch to our different geometry. But for our user, if we were to give this as a tool, this is not very clear about what's happening. So instead, what we can use is a mapping pop-up menu. Go to those options. Now we have two options here. We have the display and we have the underlying result. So I'm just going to clear that and add a 4 again. So I'll move this over. We want, first one is a sphere. Then we have our teapot. Next is the torus. And finally our cone. Okay. Now this makes a little bit more sense. So for this switch option, the best one to use would be this mapping pop-up menu, where the underlying numbers are driving the switch, but the user can easily see what they're getting. Okay. And lastly, we have this checkbox option, which allows us to just tick on or off, just like a Boolean. So it's kind of your preference if you want a Boolean or a checkbox. And we also have this null option, which you have for any of these. And that basically doesn't display, and it allows you to have a parameter there that is ready to be used with a null. Okay. Leave it as a mapping pop-up menu. Just add these back because I think that's the best option for this one. And then what we'll do is we'll move on to strings. Okay. So we don't need to look at this anymore. So we're just going to focus on the macro. And we're going to add string. And then we're going to rename this to my string. And let's see what options we have for strings. So the first one is scene graph location. So this is pretty straightforward. It allows you to add a scene graph location. And you can adopt scene graph selection, etc. Next, we have attribute name. So if we were to have this at default and middle mouse click and drag an attribute onto here, it will give us the value of the attribute. So in this case, PC_sphere. But if we were to then use the attribute name and do the same thing and drag this on here, now it gives us the full path to this attribute. So attribute editor.exclusive2. Now it might not be obvious to the user that this is what's going to happen. So if I was using this, I would most likely add help text to this to say you can drop an attribute on this parameter. Okay, now with help text you can use HTML to give it, different displays, making things like bold, for example. You can drop an attribute on this parameter, that kind of thing. Anything you like. You can use, paragraphs, anything. You can insert links and images. So you can put in quite a lot of information about what this parameter does. And you can also choose what icon. So is it just a normal message, or is it a warning or an error? That's pretty handy. And then you get this icon and you can find out what this is doing. Next, we have the attribute type. And this gives you all the different attribute types that you have. So, integer, double, float, string, group. And the same thing you can do is middle mouse, click and drag onto here, and it'll automatically set the attribute type based on the one you drop down. Next is pretty straightforward again, is the cell statement. So, we can add paths or custom. So, we can drag in a path here or do something like root world / star sort of thing. Now, again, let's link a parameter to this so we can see what's happening. Just going to drop in a dot node and make that a group and add user parameter here of string, and for this test string, we're going to link this one as well using the same equals up user.myString. And now we can see the result of this is just a string, and it has our first path plus our cell of root world / star. And you could always just link this to a cell statement inside. So say, for example, you had an op script, you could link the cell of the op script to the top level. So you're just exposing the cell statement that your op script will run on to the user. Oh, I'll just have both of them displayed so we can see the result of anything that we do. Okay, and I'll just finishing editing this and get rid of these for now, make it a bit clearer. Next is resolution. So this loads the resolution from your resolution table, and you can choose your different resolutions, and it will give you the string of the name of that resolution, not the actual resolution values. Okay, and we have this asset option, and that gives you this browse, so you can browse for a file. But if you were to use the asset API at your studio to link to your asset database, then you can use that on here as well. So it would actually have more than one tab when you browse, and as well as having file, it would have your product, your asset option. So then you can browse whatever database you're using for your assets to import those in. And you can see that as well if we go to the widget options for a asset, you have these extra options. So tabs to show, product, and file. So if you set up your product tab, it will display there. And you can also use asset type tags. So is this a volume, or is it geometry, etc. File type filters. So is this an EXR, texture, that kind of thing. You can set your context. So you can have more than one context for in your asset API. you know, you might have different context to hold different information. You've got image viewer, so you can set the image viewer, and you can force the file, is it a file or not? Okay. Whereas if we were to just set this to be in a regular file path, you do not have all of those widget options. You just have, is it a sequence? Next, we have the Boolean pop-up and mapping pop-up menu. They're exactly the same as the number version. Just to note that with the Boolean, it is actually yes and no now, not 1 and 0. We have a script button. This allows you to run some Python code when someone clicks your button. So say this is my button, and put in some code. So let's just add some code in. So this is taking PyQt5 and importing the Qt widgets, and then loading in the Q message box with a warning saying, how dare you push my button, and having an OK on that. So if we now click this button, we now get this, how dare you push my button. And you can find out what version of PyQt from about Katana, and then it says it's PyQt5, Qt5. Next we have checkbox. So again, the same as Boolean, it's yes or no as the answer. Now we have this teleparameter option. This is pretty powerful. And to demonstrate what it does is I'm going to grab hold of the sphere. I'll just remove that one as well. So we have this drop parameter here for our teleparameter, and I've also loaded in the sphere primitive create. And what we can do is we can middle mouse click and drag a parameter. Now these are linked. So if I change this to no, changes this. So this is a little bit different to what we were doing before, where we were, you know, using reference expressions or Python expressions to link two parameters. Now it is directly loading that parameter into this display. So this has the advantage of you're not doing any expressions or anything, but it also has the disadvantage of it's exactly the same as what is inside this node. So it's called exactly the same thing, has all the same features, which might be fine for you, it might not, depends on what kind of tool you're building. The great thing about this drop parameter here is you can drop things like a whole group parameter and it will load all of those options, or even you can drop the entire node. Oh, is that not? There we go, entire node. And now we have all of the node options. Okay, so if I were then just to view my macro by itself and finish editing user parameters, we can see this inside here. So we've got our one parameter here and the entire node of my primitive create exposed to change things. Okay. Let's just change that to the next one, which is a script editor. Now when we do that, we see this has been made into an expression. And if we click this down, we can see what was happening is when we were dropping the parameter here, it was creating an expression to whatever parameter or node you add in here, and then resolving the name of it, or the, like, you know, the full path to that parameter, and then adding that into it, and then the widget would then bring that all in. We don't need that anymore because this is now something else, so we're just going to change it back to being constant. And now this has our script editor. This doesn't have any syntax highlighting or anything like that. It's not set to any type of code, but you might want to have something like this in yours for the user to be able to write some code and then maybe have a button added to read this information and then run that code. And then we have the same null option, and that's it for strings. So let's move on to the next one, group. So when we add a group, we also get this add option. So instead of adding the parameters here, we can add them here directly into the group. So let's rename our group to my group. You've got parameters that you've already made that you want to add in to your group. You can use this up and down arrow to move things around and drop it straight into here. Or you can just add them straight into the group. So let's say, for example, we add 3 numbers, and let's call this X, Y, Z. And then we finish editing user parameters. We see we have my group with X, Y, and Z, and I collapse it, and you can't see these values anymore. Now, if I change the widget type to multi, and I finish editing my parameters, and I drop this down, instead of it being hidden, they're now listed across. So this is something that you kind of get, say, for example, with things like scale, where it would be called scale and have your X, Y, and Z all listed together, or you can drop it down and change them individually. That's a UI option if you want to do something like that. So next we have the widget type gradient. So if we add that, it's going to complain this is not set up the way we want it. So let's remove X, Y, and Z. And now we can add our points for our gradient. So this gives you 2 options, position and color for each one that you add. And you can set up a gradient for that. So we can, start off at 0 and then work our way to 1 and do some colors. We've set ourselves a gradient. And then the other 2 options, float ramp and color ramp, if I were to add one of these in, again, it would complain, but this time we can't do anything about this. Color ramp and float ramp are quite particular about how they get set up. So if you want to add one of those, it's actually better to use them from the menu here rather than setting them up from a group and then trying to set it up from there. Okay, and we'll go to those later. And that's it for groups. Next, we have the number array. We go to the options for that, and widget type. We can change it from default to color. This gives us a nice color widget. And this color widget has some options. So you can set the film look visualization, true or false. Enable no film look color space. And then we can restrict the components to 0 and 1 if you want to make sure you don't get any values over that. And then if we leave it back at the default, we can set the size of the array. So, you could set it maybe to 4 rows by 4 columns, and then you need to finish editing user parameters to see those values across. Now you'll notice now that the user wouldn't be able to change these values, they're locked in. But you might have noticed, for example, on an attribute set node, that you have a number array that you can change these values. So how can we add this functionality to our node? Well, one thing that we can do is select both the nodes at the same time and then make sure we have edit user parameters on our node. We can middle mouse click and drag this number value and add that to our own macro. And you see this number value has this same way of being able to edit the number of rows and columns. But if I were to click here, you would see that it's come with conditional visibility options. It's inherited that from the original parameter. Okay, so we could just clear all of these out. Now, one little thing that I wanted to go through as another tip is we could actually look at the underlying code of this to find out what is set to make it enable these values. So if we go to our Python tab, we middle mouse click and drag over our parameter. So that's all this as param equals. And from our param, we can get hint string. Now the hint string on a parameter defines how it's going to look, you know, what widget type is set to it, what conditional visibility options are set, all that kind of thing. So let's print this out and see what it's set to. So it has a few dictionary options. So it has the help to say the overriding value. So with this little help here, the overriding value. And it's set to open is true and resize is true. And this resize true is what gives it this value here. So let's see if we could take our original parameter and add this hint string to it. So let's middle mouse click and drag this down here. And new param, I'll call this. I'll just check what the hint string of this is at the moment. And it should be empty. You see? So we're going to make our new one up for this. So we're going to use the set hint string. Okay, so this is going to be a string that contains a dictionary of items, and what we just want to do is add resize is true. Okay, now let's see if this will change this to enable us to change the values. We're just going to select this and can hit Control Enter to run it. Now our new param we can change the values to. So that's a great little tip for being able to really see how some widgets are set up. If there's anything that is not in the option menu but you've seen on another parameter and you want to find out what's going on, you can make a copy of it into your own node and then find the hint string that it generates for it to see how you could then set it on your node. Okay. So let's just look at this node now. We'll remove our number arrays. We'll move on to the next one, which is a string array. And then for the widget type of that, we can do scene graph locations. So this is a list of scene graph locations. And then you can add, you know, scene graph locations to this. It doesn't have any options. But this could be a good way of storing lots of locations through an array, especially if you're doing something like cooking a cell statement and then you want to store all the paths, and it will come into this. And then next we have the float vector. So this just stores a vector, doesn't have any options. And you have to setting some numbers here. And if you were to set this to be something that isn't a number, say A, It will give you this warning up here to say you could not convert this string into a float vector. Then next we have colors. So this is what we already talked about, where you have this color option here that you could have set from a number array. And then if you had 4 values, again, you'd get this with the alpha. So it's pretty straightforward for these color wheels. So just skip past those because it's pretty straightforward. Next we have the color ramp. It allows us to make a color ramp. And for the widget options of this, we can set the gradient height, so you can make this bigger. You think that would help your user. And we have the float ramp. This creates a float ramp, and you can add points with Control, Alt, and click. And you'll notice that this is a linear connection between our points. You can change the look of this through the presets. So I can change this, for example, to a smooth min and max, and now the interpretation is smooth. But what if you wanted to change this now back to linear and not use a preset, or maybe you wanted to change this so you have it as Bezier, so you can use Bezier curves? How can we do that? Okay, what we're going to do is have a look at the underlying parameters of this one. So let's drag this one over to our Python tab, and what we're going to do is look at get children, and this will find all of the children of this parameter, because what this parameter is a group node, a group parameter, and it contains more parameters to be able to build this this ramp. And one of the parameters inside is this interp, which is its interpretation. So we can actually change the interpretation of this by changing this parameter. So what we can do is go to that by dot interp. Now, first of all, let's see what the current value is. So we do get value. And then when you do that, you need to give it a frame. So we'll just give it 0 because it's not animated. We'll see that the value it has is catmore_rom. And then we can change it by using set value, and we'll give it Bezier. And again, we'll set it to 0 because there's no animation. And now our ramp has Bezier curves, and we can click on these arrows to move the handles around and change what it looks like. So that's just something to think about when you're building a UI for your macro, is that you can delve into it and see what's going on under the hood and change things. Okay, next we have the button options. We've already done this button, but there's also a toolbar. So that allows you to have more than one button. So it adds 2 buttons by default. We can also go to the widget options and just make this a little bit bigger. You can see there's our 2 buttons, each with its own script text. Then you can click add up here to add another button. You can even add a stretch, which allows you to have a break between your buttons, and then you can use the arrows again to move things around. So we can have our 2 buttons and then a gap and then another button. Okay. Next we have teleparameter, which we've already talked about. And finally we have node drop proxy. We can add that in, and it has this drop node here, and you can give it a name. So let's say, for example, we'll say it's going to be an attribute set node, and we're going to take our attribute set node that we had here and middle mouse click and drag this over, and we'll get this icon to it, which shows that the node has been added. And now we can middle mouse click on this, and we have the node, and we can drop it wherever we want to go. So this would be handy, for example, if you had a node inside of your macro that you wanted to expose to your user to allow them to drop it onto other nodes. Okay, and that's it for all the different parameter types. So as you can see, there's plenty of options there. We also wanted to go through the conditional visibility and conditional lock-in options. So let's have a look at that. So what we're going to do is set some conditional visibility options for our button. So you see here it has this add condition, and you have lots of different options you can do. You know, is it greater than, is it less than, does it contain, and you can even use regex, and we're just going to do equal to, and then it adds this if parameter with this magnifying glass. You click that and it lists your parameters. By default, it will only show the ones that's in the same group as the parameter that you're setting the visibility for. If you untick this, it will list all your parameters. And you can see here with our groups, it has parameters underneath. So, you know, how we looked at the interpretation. But we are only interested in my number. And that we're going to see is 1. So when it's a teapot. So if we set it to teapot, it will display our buttons, otherwise it won't. And you can add more conditions as well, and you can make this quite complex. So you can say, you know, does it contain for this, and you can have a whole and if it's all of these as well. So you can really control how your UI looks based on these rules. Okay, and then just to show you this working, currently it's set to sphere and our buttons are gone. We change it to teapot and our buttons appear. Change it to torus and it's gone again. Excellent. Let's also look at this conditional locking. So I'm just going to add a string. Just move this up next to our number. Just rename this as text, for example. And currently I can type in here, and if I change the additional locking options, say greater than, we'll set it for the number again. So if it's greater than 1, then we'll be able to lock it. So as we set this to less than 1, we can now type in it. That's 0, that's 1, we can still type in it. But we go greater than 1, it's now locked, we can no longer type in it. So again, this gives you some really good options for when you're building your UI. Okay, so that's all of the options that you get for building parameters. There's one last thing that I wanted to share with you, and that's now that we've constructed your macro UI, you might want to change this help button at the top here. So by default, when you click on this, it's going to go to the Foundries page for a group node. But we might want to change this so it goes to a help page that we've built on our own internal wiki to explain what this node does. So how can we do that? Well, again, we're going to use this set hid string, and we're going to do that on the root parameter. So to get the root parameter, we're going to middle mouse click up here and drag it down, and that's going to get the node and then dot get parameters, and that returns the root parameter. I'm going to store that in a variable, and for the root param, we're going to set the hint string, and again we're going to use this to make it a string of a dictionary, and we're going to use help URL, and let's set the path now to be Google. So we've set the hint string, but when we click on this, it's still going to take us to group node. So how can we have that work? What we need to do is, first of all, we need to save our macro. So to do that, we're going to finish editing our parameters, and then we're going to save as macro. And let's save it as my macro and accept. And now we tab and load in our new macro and click on help. We're now going to Google. Okay. So that's it. That's all the things I wanted to cover about how you can build a UI. Next time we'll look at how we can use this as an example.